Hello.
Hi, Zara, how are you doing?
Hi.
Okay, good. Finally, I think we'll get this thing knocked out.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, let me get my let me get this, change this image over. Okay.
So you were able to find all the slides that were missing?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm not sure what happened, but anyway. Yeah, so I may just want to make sure yeah, I have everything together. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. And
Awesome.
just let me know when you're ready.
I'm ready to go.
So I guess you can start recording.
Yes, it automatically records.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so welcome back, everyone. We're going to be talking about ornamentation in the building arts. There's many different types, an integral ornamentation versus applied. We're going to be talking about classical versus Gothic ornamentation, then shifting from Baroque to Rococco, Art Deco, and some other buildings and details. So earlier in the class, we talked about the language of ornamentation based on the language of the original wooden Etruscan temple, then of course later stylized as stone and marble in, of course, the Greek and Roman classical temples. Obviously, again, we can see that on the right, the stone has replaced the wood timber frame as stone and marble. But we're looking at is several different terms. This, of course, is the facade of the Parthenon in ancient Greece. We're looking at the main pyramidal tympanum in the front, of course, with the metopes and the triglyphs showing mostly the carvings between the frieze, of course, and the pediment. So what that means is some terms we really haven't talked about. Ultimately, we've talked about the triglyph and metope, but then we haven't really talked about some of the details around the top of the building core, the acroterion, which of course is the crown at the very top of the building. This is a very significant detail that marks the center of the building. It's actually a Greek for the summit, and this is a very popular Greek classical detail. You can definitely see that there's a headdress and some other sort of curvilinear leaf forms around the top of that. So this actually was the original top of the ancient Parthenon in Greece. The sculptures and the carvings below that are, of course, have been removed. And of course, Lord Elgin has replaced these in the British Museum. So what we're looking at is, this is actually a reproduction of the ancient Parthenon frieze. And I just thought that was an interesting detail that reappears in Greek architecture at the center. Also, there's some other interesting details. I think we've seen the Greek key design was a very popular motif in pretty much ancient classical architecture. You can see what it looks like is a symbol of infinity, because it's hard to tell the beginning and the end. And of course, parts of this could probably be based on the sort of undulating river from the Asia Minor. You can see like the sort of undulating narrative of the curves transferred into a square as kind of symbol of infinity. So then also we have some basic from our earlier moldings discussion, is that the typical Greek and Roman motifs in ornamentation, of course, are called the water leaf mold and of course the bead and rail. These are very popular typical ancient Greece and Roman details. So we can see that the bead and reel is at the bottom, the water leaf is a stylized leaf form at the very top. This appears in many different ancient Greek and Roman motifs and themes. And we can see it used between the volutes and the Ionic capital. And of course, we see it on the architrave, between the architrave and of course the bottom of the frieze. Then we also see these classical details really around the Ionic volutes. There's even carvings in one of the scrolls between the volutes. What I was saying earlier is a lot of the fragments and the sculptures or the carvings from the ancient Parthenon have been taken from the Parthenon frieze and of course put into the British Museum. So we're looking at is these are the different fragments that are left over from the ancient Parthenon. And so when you go to the British Museum, you can see the entire frieze, the sculptures in one particular view. Now, these are remarkable for them being carved by hand by chisels. You know, now we have power tools to do this. So, okay, so we've talked a lot about Greek and Roman architecture. We're going to shift over to Gothic again. Gothic ornamentation is somewhat different. It's a little bit similar to classical Greece, but for the most part, you know, the Gothic ornamentation tells a story because, of course, you know, people were not that literate. So the sculptures, the stained glass windows actually tell narratives from the Bible, and they have scriptures because people couldn't read. So, of course, the stained glass windows were a story to tell. You can actually go to cathedral and understand scriptures from the Bible just based on the sculptures and, of course, the stained glass windows. So obviously, you know, the ornamentation was not really decorative for decoration's sake. They were actually an integral part of the building. You know, of course, everyone sees Gothic architecture as the flying buttresses, which we see here. Again, not every piece of that ornamentation is decorative. Parts of it are structural because, of course, the finials, the vertical elements, are the counterweights, the anchors that anchor the flying buttresses down to the ground for the Gothic cathedrals. So we're getting into a case where it's called ornamentation on top of ornament. Now, again, these are the finials or the buttresses where the flying buttresses die into. There are carvings and ornamentations all over everything. It's a little bit hard to tell where the building actually ends, of the building's envelope ends, and of course the enclosure of the space begins. So in Gothic architecture, we have a wonderful term. It's called horror vacui. It means fear of leaving anything undecorated. Pretty much every square inch of this facade, well, these flying buttresses, there is carving and detail on everything. It's an incredible sort of landscape of details, crenellations, and finials. The same thing with this typical French Gothic facade is that there's tracery in flying buttress, but of course the buttresses and the tracery are ornamented with all these incredible decorations. If you look at John Ruskin's work, of course, it's romanticized in Gothic architecture. His drawings alone are a sketchbook of just the sort of love and passion he has for Gothic architecture. Definitely, he was against Renaissance architecture, but so we look at his sketchbooks, he's really focusing on Gothic architecture, definitely not Renaissance architecture. There's some other interesting details. We talk about Gothic architecture, particularly the Tudor architecture that is in, of course, Hampton Court Palace. We're seeing the wooden timber frames as an early sort of truss formation. Of course, ornamentation actually terminates and finalizes all the details in, of course, these wooden beams. So here's some wonderful details of a lot of, you know, Tudor architecture that is adorned with classical detailing, figures, and crest from the monarchs, of course, the monarch and the British family and the Tudor dynasty. You know, we're going to be looking at a mixture of interesting neoclassical, well, I'm sorry, classical styles with Gothic architecture. Of course, the ceiling has the tracery, which is gilded and gold leaf. And of course, the ceiling is painted blue. But it's really interesting to see that the classical architecture and the Gothic architecture is melded together as one sort of large meeting place. It's interesting to see the mixture of the two styles together, because normally in Gothic and classical architecture, you really wouldn't see both of those mixed together. So if you look at a ceiling detail, not all of this decoration is really decorative for decoration's sake. Most of these are structural. Of course, the ribs, of course, the quatrefoils, the four circles are actually the structural ribs of the ceiling. They're not really that decorative. So it's a case where ornamentation becomes the structural part of the ceiling. These are actually stone ribs in the Gothic cathedral. This is a wonderful detail of the building that I live in, the Kirby in downtown Dallas. We're seeing a mixture of interesting sort of eclectic styles, but for the most part, the leaf forms here are really not quite as classical and stylized as the Corinthian capitals in ancient Greece and Rome. They're, of course, these free-form leafed sort of motifs. It's interesting, you see the image on the right is that it's strange to mix the classical details with the Gothic details. The classical detail is the square pentive that is there on the column. Of course, we're seeing a water leaf detail, which you really normally would not see mixed with Gothic architecture. Of course, the crenellations there are based off of beer hops plant forms because, of course, the building is built for the Budweiser Corporation founder. So we're looking at some of the details that are showing these sort of leaf forms for beer hops. Of course, the Adolphus Hotel and the Kirby building were built at the same time to celebrate these incredible architectural details based off of the Budweiser Beer Corporation owners' sort of vocabulary. Of course, here is an exterior detail showing, it's interesting, we'd see the cross section of some of these elements that are not completely adorned with detail. We can see the cross section of some of these crenellations that are not completely covered up by decoration. This is an extraordinary example of Gothic detailing. And of course, this is the University of Oklahoma's library in Norman, Oklahoma. What we're looking at is the Gothic language of architecture incredibly displayed here. It's really interesting that you can see that the words library are carved and floating above the back of the composition. So of course, it's interesting that that stone piece is just hanging out there away from the main body of the facade. Really original and very difficult to do. So we're going to be taking a look at where ornamentation becomes overdone and is somewhat leaving or losing the sort of poetics and the understanding of architectural space. Of course, this is typically the Rococo interiors for the 1700s, really after the Baroque. But what we're seeing is decorative colors and a mixture of different materials all in sort of one sort of disgusting zone. You can see that pretty much every surface is completely adorned with gold leaf carvings and plaster. It's getting a little bit hard to tell where the architectural form is because, of course, it is so over-decorated with decoration and detailing. So most of these are a mixture of wood painted with gold leaf and plaster. Not everything in here is marble and stone. But you can clearly see that the decoration is somewhat just gotten a little bit too overdone where it's really difficult to see the architectural facades as a planar element. So a little bit more clarity in terms of decoration. Of course, this is the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Part of this is a symbol of infinity. The mirrors reflect each other. You can see the floor is completely reversed. You can see the ceiling and the floor. It's hard to tell, where the floor and the walls actually end because it's so beautifully ambiguous with the layers of the polished floor and of course the mirrors. But the ornamentation is so overdone that we still can read the perpendicular or the parallel hallway with, of course, the chandeliers, which sort of make the hallway read like kind of what's called an early virtual architecture. Really, it's hard to see where the building ends and of course the space ends and begins. This is a place where the ornamentation is carefully done. It's not completely overdone because we can still see the rectilinear facades and of course the windows, the mirrors on each side of the corridor. So when you look at Spanish Baroque architecture, of course, we're still seeing the classical form, but it is somewhat so overdone, it's really hard to see where the facade is or the openings occur in the wall. It's really incredible, but the thing about this is that the Spanish Baroque architecture is very overdone. Same thing with this interior. There's almost so much visual information, it's hard to digest the space. Of course, we can see the side chapels and of course the corridor with, of course, the pilasters. But everything is so crenellated and overdone, it's really kind of almost visibly hard to understand the architectural space. So later we're going to be talking about the arts and crafts movement. This is really the late 1800s. We've seen Green Brothers, some of their wooden extraordinary house that they did in California. This, of course, is William Morse. He's a wonderful, not really an architect, but an artist, published books on engravings and drawings and prints. This is his own house called the Red House. Of course, the arts and crafts movement. Of course, obviously the house is a red brick, hence the name, the Red House. But we see kind of an eclectic sort of series of repitches and styles. The interior is kind of a tamed, sort of simplistic sort of version of the arts and crafts movement. We see parts of the Gothic arch articulated with the brick masonry. We see a very primitive wooden staircase, but of course, his entire pamphlet and oeuvre is a mixture of leaf forms and of course engravings and drawings. So when you look at a William Morris interior, we can clearly see that his wallpaper, his drawings have been transferred into fabrics, wallpaper, and of course, pretty much on any sort of horizontal or vertical surface. So here's the exterior, kind of an interesting eclectic grouping of parts and arrangements. Here are some of his drawings, engravings, some other images. Interesting what he does with the arch tympanum above that. It's open. We see that the frieze breaks open, of course, continues the columnar elements across the frieze. Of course, pretty much everything in this room he designed and decorated. We're going to shift over to something interesting. It's called the Art Nouveau movement. This is roughly before we get to Art Deco. This is really after Baroque and Rococco. This is roughly, Paris and France, roughly between 1890 and 1910. Here are some, it's called the Peacock Room, designed by James Swisser, an interesting mixture of where the ornamentation becomes a total integral part of the facade details. They're not really just decorative parts that are applied onto, but it's integrated into the tracer on the ceiling and of course the wall pattern. So we can see that it's kind of a variation of a Gothic ceiling, because we see the tracery and of course the stalactites that hang down from the ceiling become these light fixtures. So what's interesting is that the decoration becomes a functional element. The little stylized bamboo panels in between the windows become actually shelves for the ceramic objects. So it's interesting where the decoration becomes a complete integral part of the interior, the facade. The same thing with this interior and with this interior Art Nouveau ornamentation. Pretty much everything in this room is a very sinewy sort of Art Nouveau. You look at Alphonse Mucha's work, Antonio Gaudi's work, there's really no straight hard edge in this. It's a case where the decoration is completely integral part of the ceiling and the wall fabric. So the furniture that's built into the wall and the freestanding furniture is all completely visibly melded together as these large sort of wavy tree-like branches. So it's a condition where the ornamentation not just applied on, it's integral into the wall and the ceiling. So earlier we talked about architecture in America, roughly Louis Sullivan's work. We saw this last week. What Louis Sullivan is doing is his, complete study or grammar of ornament is adorned here in a skyscraper. What he's doing is it's not just decoration to make the building look pretty, but the story is he's actually building an early skyscraper as a tree that's been removed from the forest and placed into the city. So pretty much all these details are sort of a metaphor of the tree that used to be in the forest and is now in the city. We've looked at these before, but what's intriguing is, of course, not only did he have the imagination and skill to draw these, but to convey these to a sculptor and create these is really incredible. It's interesting what he does with some of the details. Of course, these are plant-like leaf forms, but what he's doing is he's using a geometric underlay and of course incorporating the leaf forms on top of that. What we're doing is we're looking at sort of a hint at early modern architecture, because the repetitive horizontal, if you can see my cursor, is that the horizontals embrace the sort of egg-like form in the center and of course engage the floral-like motifs. What's interesting is that we can see that the horizontal bands actually engage the leaf forms. It's really original to sort of use those repetitive horizontal lines as a precursor to modern architecture, similar to what Frank Lloyd Wright was doing in his early work before he went completely modern. But we're looking at is his preliminary drawings for the geometric basis of each one of these particular shapes. Now, it's not just an arbitrarily mixture of just free-form plant, like you can see the beginning of the underlying geometry behind that. And these are just his exquisite working drawings showing his plant-like forms. Here's another one he did called the Carson Pirie Scott building. We've looked at this before as a horizontal window as an early sort of modern sort of window inflection. It's really strange to have a horizontal window in classical architecture. But of course, this is a transition from classical to modern. Here is actually the ground floor storefront. Just an incredible display of plant-like forms, drawn and sculpted in cast iron, not wood or marble. So this is just an extraordinary display of architectural ornament. It's not frivolous, it does mean something because of course, Louis Sullivan is bringing the tree from the forest into the actual city. And these are just extraordinary examples of a mixture of, you can see the reflection of his Chicago window in the background reflected in this incredible plant-like leaf form. Look at his earlier bank buildings, it's the same extraordinary exuberant geometry mixed, of course, with the plant-like leaf forms. It's interesting that an early modernist is using ancient Roman architecture. We see the large curved barrel vault that's appearing on the facade, adorned with his extraordinary language of architectural detailing and plant-like motifs. Just the chandelier alone is an extraordinary sort of drawing invention of light bulbs and of course, sinewy plant-like leaf forms. It's interesting what a modernist does with a classical building. Of course, it's still classical because we're looking at, you know, the decorative elements adorning the facade, but this is like a large pipe organ with leaded glass in, of course, between the stone carved frames. Interesting, it's a little bit similar to what Wright is doing in 1904 with his Larkin building, is that everything that he and Louis Sullivan does has a meaning to it. If you look at the column capitals, he sort of stylizes the classical, the motif in sort of a modernistic sensibility. So the capitals on top of the columns actually become the same motif as the floor plan. So the column capitals are a small little abstract variation of the floor plan of the Larkin building itself. I'm just going to kind of end with some simple Art Deco details. The Helsinki train station by Eliel Saarinen, an early modernist. But it's a case where we're looking at the ornamentation is not completely overdone like some of the Baroque and Rococco interiors that we just saw earlier. It's interesting that we're looking at mostly plaster and stone. So he kind of emphasizes the structural capacity by having very delicate details adorning the columns that separate the windows. And of course, here is a detail of one of his own house he did. Very simple, elegant details. If you want to see an extraordinary book on just architectural grammar of ornament, Owen Jones has pretty much drawn most of classical antiquity, the ancient Egyptian capitals, classical architecture motifs, and plant-like forms in his book called The Grammar of Ornament. So there's these beautiful sort of plates and engravings in each one of these. So again, we can see the Greek key design, which is adorned and celebrated in his pamphlet of architectural ornament, The Grammar of Ornament. So next Tuesday is our last lecture on building construction. You'll be able to see the way that some of these buildings are actually physically made with stone, marble, steel, iron, and cast iron as more of an explicit sort of exploration of the actual structure, the nature of the construction materials. So stay tuned for next Tuesday for the final lecture, and hopefully I will see everyone in January. And Kira, thanks for hosting the lecture again.
Of course, always happy to do so.
Okay, I guess since we don't have any students at this, we're not going to entertain questions. This will be the end of the lecture.
Yeah, that's fine by me. Perfect.
Okay, and I do have something at 4.
Sorry, what was that?
I said, I think you have something at 4, right?
Yes, I do. Unless you want to, like, I don't know, come up with questions yourself right now and answer them, but we still have a few minutes.
Oh, okay. I thought you had to leave. No, I think I'm finished with the lecture. I just, because normally I send a PDF out with 10 questions that the class can answer.
Okay.
So I think we can go ahead and end the lecture now, and then
Yeah,
I'll see everybody next Tuesday then.
Awesome. That sounds great.
Thanks again.
So enjoy the afternoon and talk to you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.